Hello, I'm Rebecca Robertson, Adam R. Flato, founding president and executive producer of Park Avenue Armory. Welcome to our third event of the 2023 Malkin Lecture Series. Tonight we get an inside look at the extraordinary 35-year friendship between President Theodore Roosevelt and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. The Roosevelts have a long history with the 7th Regiment. Elliott Roosevelt, Theodore's brother, was a prominent member of Company K, while their cousin, Emlyn, was in Company A. And Elliott's daughter, Eleanor Roosevelt, hosted many fundraising events at the Armory through the Depression and donated money to the building in her father's memory. Teddy Roosevelt had his own connections with the 7th Regiment. As a rising politician in New York's 1880s, his career intersected with the regiment's official business many times. And a decade later, as governor, he was the commander-in-chief to the National Guard, of which the regiment is a member. Perhaps, and most poignantly, he wrote a letter to the regiment a month before they shipped out to World War I, which we have in our archives. We are guided on this exploration by Laurence Jurdem, currently an adjunct professor of history at Fairfield University and Fordham College. A frequent writer on American politics, his articles have appeared in The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and the San Francisco Chronicle. And now, please, enjoy the program.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I was looking at the website trying to find a ticket for a friend of mine, and I noticed it said, Laurence Jurdem, Rough Rider and Professor, sold out. And I thought, God, how gratifying, because I now have something finally in common with Taylor Swift. It's wonderful to be here and see so many of you to come out on such a kind of a gloomy evening. And one of the things I thought I would start with was, since we're talking about a couple of men throughout this presentation, I thought I'd open it up a little bit with one of my favorite characters, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who was Theodore Roosevelt's eldest daughter, born in 1884 and died in 1980. I put the dates up because she led an unbelievably long life. And she had a couple of quotes which I really love. One of which is, if you don't have anything nice to say about someone, come sit next to me. The other quote that I like, and I think it's appropriate, is when she's talked about her father and said, my father was someone who wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. And I think that's appropriate because I thought I would open up my talk a little bit to those of you who are really interested in history or sort of the background of history or how these books are written or how someone might say how the sausage is made. And during the last part of TR's life, he may have been sitting with Senator Lodge, and Senator Lodge was a historian, one of the first PhDs given by Harvard, and TR and he would be sitting together perhaps, and Roosevelt said to his friend Cabot, because of all the letters they'd exchanged over the years, 35 years, 2,500 letters, and TR said, gee, Cabot, what if you sort of put all these letters together and annotated them? This could be the best book about me ever written. Well, Lodge, as some of you may know, didn't have a particularly great sense of humor. He was very serious about history, and he thought that was rather an interesting idea. And so after TR passed away in 1919, Lodge found himself going through Roosevelt's letters, and as he began reading through them, particularly a letter where Theodore Roosevelt, as a younger man, referred to his boss at the time, Benjamin Harrison, as a scrawny little toad. Lodge thought perhaps, well, do we really want to have a completely unedited collection of letters between me and Theodore Roosevelt saying some of the things that TR and Senator Lodge, who was no shrinking violet either, liked to say about his political opponents. Don't try to read this. This is a letter from Henry Cabot Lodge to TR. You know, my wife was looking at this a few weeks ago, and she said, "Is this really what you spend all day doing?" This is a letter that was written to TR by Henry Cabot Lodge when Roosevelt was in the White House, undoubtedly asking for something. Lodge was always asking about something that he could do for Roosevelt, or rather something Roosevelt could do for him. And this is actually a letter from Roosevelt to Lodge written in 1910 when Theodore Roosevelt was off on his grand tour, his grand safari, his grand tour of Europe. And as Lodge was kind of writhing in agony over what William Howard Taft was doing back in Washington. And so when Lodge gets to the end of his life in 1924, right before he passes away, he publishes these two books. And they are the selections being key word, from the correspondence of Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge. And Lodge, and this is what's to me most extraordinary and something I wanted to point out because my book is based on these letters, and Lodge was a historian, and a Harvard historian at that. Lodge decided that he would not only edit the letters, he would dramatically edit the letters. He would change phrases. He would delete passages. He would remove portions of the letters. So essentially, if one purchased either of these books, and they're available on Google Books or wherever your finer antiquated books are sold, these books are entirely inaccurate and completely useless. And I thank goodness that HCL had let's just say, the wherewithal to keep all of these original letters which I used, or there wouldn't have been any book at all. But then again, Henry Cabot Lodge was a politician, and a very good politician at that. He was a very conniving, very calculating, very Machiavellian individual who rarely was transparent in any way, shape, or form, except maybe right here. This is Henry Cabot Lodge in an undated photograph taken on the shores of what was known as East Point, which was his estate on Nahant. And Henry Cabot Lodge, one of the things that Henry Cabot Lodge adored doing, and he makes no bones about this in his autobiography, My Early Life, written in 1913, the same year that Theodore Roosevelt's autobiography came out, he loved skinny dipping. This was one of his favorite activities and something he had been doing since he was a young man, and many of his contemporaries did as well. This is a photograph of the home at East Point. It was the place that we could refer to in kind of current phrase as Henry Cabot Lodge's happy place. He loved Nahant. He grew up there. He learned how to ride. He learned how to swim. He learned how to sail. He learned how to play tennis. And it was really the center of his political seat where he ran for office and tended to spend most of his time. Lodge wouldn't be caught dead in a place like Newport. It was completely counter to his nature, completely counter to his view of a society which, as he entered political life, he believed was becoming more and more garish, more and more corrupt, and more distasteful. So since I put Henry Cabot Lodge in a rather, let's just say, uncomfortable position, or rather a position that he probably wouldn't have liked to have seen if he were here looking at that photograph and seeing himself naked on the shores of Nahant, I thought I would put Theodore Roosevelt who's wearing a rather entertaining outfit in the Dakota Territory in 1885. Like Lodge with Nahant, Roosevelt adored the West. It was something that he would return to time and time again when things got difficult. And there was no year more difficult than the previous year of 1884, where Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge first met. And they met because of the man on the left, with the gray beard, a gentleman by the name of James Blaine. James Blaine, who was a gentleman from Maine, who had been a senator from Maine, a speaker from the House, and a man who desperately wanted to be president. And James Blaine was one of the great political characters of his day. He was a charismatic figure. He was a very good-looking man, a wonderful orator. He would rehearse meticulously for every single speech he gave. He ran for president several times and very much hoped he would be president in 1884. But underneath that confident exterior was a man who was desperately afraid, a hypochondriac, a man who was standing right next to James A. Garfield when he was shot in Washington, D.C., and obviously thought that the bullet was meant for him. In fact, there is a story which I believe is apocryphal, where Blaine's beard was so powerful, that white was so strong and so dominant that there was apparently at one time an assassin who was on the top of the Capitol dome and saw Blaine from blocks away and decided to take a shot at him. I could never find out if that story was actually true or not. This is the Chicago Convention of 1884, and this is where Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge really came to know one another very, very well. 1884 was a hard year for Theodore Roosevelt. He was in the New York State legislature. He was finishing up his tenure there. He was excited that his wife, the beautiful and frail Alice Lee, was about to give birth to his first child. He was smoking cigars with colleagues in the legislature, having a few brandies, etc. He received a telegram that his wife was in the process of giving birth, and he was, as he might have said, delighted. However, he soon received another photograph saying that Alice Lee was having terrible, terrible difficulties in the postpartum portion of the pregnancy, and he needed to return home immediately. Think about what that must have been like. Transportation was not nearly as rapid as it is today. Roosevelt on that train from Albany, going down the Hudson, minute after minute, hour after hour. He arrives at Grand Central, runs to his home on Madison Avenue, only to discover that Alice Lee was on the verge of passing away from Bright's disease. And no sooner did he arrive to try to comfort Alice Lee than his mother, the beautiful Southern belle, Mittie Roosevelt, had died as well of typhoid. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. Think about that for a moment. You lose the two people in a matter of moments who were closer to you than anything in the world. And one wonders, how do you recover from that? How does Theodore Roosevelt recover from that? Well, he did. And as he was cleaning out his home after the death of Alice Lee and after just his recent election as a delegate to the 1884 convention, he receives a letter from none other than Henry Cabot Lodge congratulating him on his election. Lodge had also been elected as a delegate from Massachusetts. The two men decide to meet, both of whom cannot stand James Blaine. Both believe that he is a corrupt Machiavellian figure who had taken money and was tarred by what was known as the Credit Mobilier scandal, a great railroad scandal of the Gilded Age, and Lodge and Roosevelt, who believed, just as the founders had believed at the beginning of our nation, that virtue was the coin of the realm, believed that James Blaine had no business being president of the United States. And so they did what they could to find someone to replace him. They were unable to do so, and so they went to the convention hoping there was a way that they might derail Senator Blaine as the standard bearer of the GOP. However, Henry Cabot Lodge was running for Congress that year. And he, already being the very thoughtful and conniving politician that he was, knew that he needed to support the presidential nominee of the GOP, or his career, what there was of it, his political career, would go into oblivion, and he couldn't allow that to happen. Theodore Roosevelt also wanted to achieve great things in the political arena, and in the end, both men begrudgingly supported James Blaine, who went on to lose to Grover Cleveland in 1884, and by the way, Henry Cabot Lodge went on to lose his congressional seat or congressional election as well. And in fact, he would lose a lot more, because all of those people who had been great friends of Henry Cabot Lodge growing up and having dinner in the beautiful buildings and townhouses of Beacon Hill couldn't stand James Blaine. And the man who would support him had no business in their dining rooms, in their drawing rooms, in their clubs, or anywhere else. And so Henry Cabot Lodge, after he decided to support James Blaine, after he lost his bid for Congress, was ostracized from Boston society, and he never forgot it. And Henry Cabot Lodge was a man who you did not want to mess with, if I may say. He had, like Theodore Roosevelt, a severe temper which could explode at any moment, and did, and I'm moving a little bit ahead of myself, but in 1917, right after he supported Woodrow Wilson for declaring war on Germany, a constituent 30 years younger than Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge was about 65 at the time, came over to Lodge, poked his finger into Lodge's chest, accused him of being a coward for voting for that resolution, and Lodge, without even a moment's hesitation, punched him right in the face. And that was the kind of man Henry Cabot Lodge was. And that was the kind of man Theodore Roosevelt was. These men had a lot in common. They were well-born, they were men of the East, they were well-read, they loved history, they loved living well, they were sporting men, and while they grew up in, we could say, sort of comfortable environments, neither one of these men, folks, were soft. They were not soft. They were determined to achieve greatness for their nation. They adored the United States. They believed the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were documents that were divine, that were God-given. And both men were determined to go into politics to take their rightful places, either as the head of their states or the head of their nation. Both men were also, as you can probably tell, great horsemen. This is Lodge on, I guess, the right, riding on his favorite horse, who was known as Toronto, and a horse that Roosevelt rode on many, many, many occasions. The story behind the photograph of Theodore Roosevelt was basically somebody asked at the time, do you mind if I take a picture of you jumping over that fence? And Roosevelt said, sure, just let me know. And he got on the horse, jumped over the fence, and it was perfect the first time he did it. I want to talk a little bit about the women in these two men's lives. Two extraordinary women, Edith Roosevelt and Nanny Lodge. Nanny Lodge, who was an extraordinary woman for her time. She was a graduate of Wellesley. She had a photographic memory. Her father was a great naval man, and Nanny could talk about any aspect of the Navy that you wanted. She was a great hostess and a great beauty. And I know that this doesn't really show it, but all I can tell you is that John Singer Sargent desperately wanted to paint her, but she was a very shy woman and really just decided not to do that. She was her husband's first and last greatest critic. Henry Cabot Lodge showed her every book, every speech that he delivered or wrote, and if she didn't like it, he would rip it up over and over and over again and throw it right in the fireplace. That's how powerful a hold she had on him. She was a tremendous woman, admired by everyone, not because of just her great beauty, but because of her intellect. James Blaine, in fact, sought her counsel frequently. And on one occasion, Nanny Lodge actually tried to get him to hire Theodore Roosevelt as his Undersecretary of State. And she asked Cabot to go across and meet with James Blaine, his great nemesis, to see if they could get a job for their dear, dear friend Theodore Roosevelt, who they desperately adored and wanted to see in some part of politics or public life. James Blaine wasn't too keen on that idea. In fact, he wrote Nanny Lodge and said, "My dear Mrs. Lodge, I so would like to be amenable to your request, but the idea of Theodore Roosevelt being my undersecretary would kind of disturb my rest whenever I went away to Bar Harbor, because I never would really know exactly what he was up to." Edith Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's second wife, really the perfect match for a man of such incredible energy, dynamism, a man who loved conversation, a man who had such great energy. She was someone who, along with Lodge, was able to at times contain that incredible temper, that incredible energy, that incredible enthusiasm, which essentially made Roosevelt one of the great figures of his time, a great intellect, a man who could read 3 books a day, a man who seemed to know everything, and at times both Lodge and Edith Roosevelt tried to prevent him from saying things that both knew would get him into a great deal of trouble. This particular photograph of Edith Roosevelt is was known as the goddess photograph. And it was a picture that Theodore Roosevelt took with him on his trip across Africa and around the world. It was his favorite photograph. And this photograph of Nanny Lodge that you're looking at is actually a photograph when TR, as president, came to stay with the Lodges on Nahant. And Nanny is flipping over her shoulder, looking at this large caravan of coaches that would be following them to the Lodge estate at East Point. And here's Nanny again. Just could never find a really wonderful photograph of her because she really was an extraordinary woman. A couple of the other characters I want to talk about. This is Bessie Davis Lodge, and the gentleman on the right is Bay Lodge, George Cabot Bay Lodge, who was Henry Cabot Lodge's son, a frustrated poet. I'm not going to go into too much about them because I'm hoping that you'll read the book, and there's a lot in there about them. One little nice tidbit about Bessie Davis. Her mother was a great social doyen of Washington, D.C., and known as the mistress of Chester A. Arthur. Her husband, conveniently enough, received a job as the Undersecretary of State in that administration, and when that happened, nobody was really terribly surprised. The relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge, which is really the center of my book, is really one of the great relationships, I think, in American history. As I said earlier, both men were very similar. Both men wanted to achieve political greatness. And Henry Cabot Lodge, for whatever reason, when he sat down with Theodore Roosevelt on that train ride down to Washington, D.C., as they sought an alternative to James Blaine, suddenly believed that this man, as he listened to TR and as TR in this wonderfully gregarious way that he had in talking, this enthusiasm, this joy, this ebullience, I think is really the perfect word, Henry Cabot Lodge concluded that this man had the capacity to be one of the great figures in history, indeed, President of the United States. And Henry Cabot Lodge was going to do everything in his power to get him there. The thing that I found so wonderful about writing about these two men is that this book is also, one could say, about mentorship. When things were going badly for both men after the campaign of 1884, Henry Cabot Lodge, uncertain about if he had a political career left, Theodore Roosevelt, wondering after the loss of his wife and mother and no political or any other kind of career in sight, both men did what great friends do for one another. They bucked one another up. They encouraged one another. They visited with one another. They wrote letters to one another, encouraging each one to mine the greatness that was within each of them, encouraging each, knowing that there would be a day where they would return to the arena, where they would achieve something significant, something greater than themselves, which is what both men very much wanted to achieve. And over time, Henry Cabot Lodge, as he ran again for Congress and won, as he ran for the Senate and won, and as he moved up the political ladder, he never forgot Theodore Roosevelt. He went out of his way to get Theodore Roosevelt every single job that Theodore Roosevelt had up and including the vice presidency. A job that Theodore Roosevelt, Edith Roosevelt, and even Theodore Roosevelt's sister, Bammy, did not want TR to have. But Henry Cabot Lodge believed that if you position someone, perhaps fate is going to take over. And at the time, Theodore Roosevelt was wasting away in the Gilded Cage that was the vice presidency. Henry Cabot Lodge wrote him a very prophetic note where around 1900, after he had been installed as vice president, Henry Cabot Lodge said, "No one can tell what will happen over the next 4 years." And by God, he was right. Because, of course, what happens is that Roosevelt becomes president after the sudden assassination of William McKinley, and Theodore Roosevelt, who literally less than 18 years earlier had been a lone, relatively unknown assemblyman, is launched into the presidency. And I honestly believe that if it was not for Henry Cabot Lodge, Theodore Roosevelt never would have attained a rise so rapid as opposed to just moving up the political ladder. I certainly believe Roosevelt would have been president at some point. But when he says, as he said on many occasions, "I rose like a rocket," the man who lit the fuse and guided that missile was Henry Cabot Lodge. And here's a picture of the White House in 1902, right around the time Theodore Roosevelt occupied it. And it was an interesting period, the presidency for Theodore Roosevelt, because it was really a time when the relationship between Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt changes. It's what I would call the changing of the guard. For many, many years, there had been sort of a public joke going around Washington about Theodore Roosevelt. He was known as the junior man in the firm of Lodge and Roosevelt. And I don't know if that got back to him, But when he became president, he began to sort of drift away from Henry Cabot Lodge's orbit. Before Roosevelt became vice president, he would write 2 to 3 letters to Lodge every single day, asking if Lodge knew of a political opportunity that was coming his way, asking if there was some kind of civil service position that he could have, asking if there was someone he could talk to for a position that would put him back into the political arena. Roosevelt becomes president, and he now begins to slowly drift out of Henry Cabot Lodge's orbit, especially politically. Lodge was a hardcore conservative who believed in the Constitution as written. Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive, and we see this during the White House period. There were a couple of moments that were interesting where perhaps one could tell that Theodore Roosevelt didn't like the fact that he was sort of viewed in a way as kind of Lodge's Svengali, so to speak. And that happened soon after he attained the presidency, and a journalist came up to him and said, "President Roosevelt, we're all so happy that you're here in the White House, but many of us are wondering, how are you going to handle your relationship with Senator Lodge? Because we all know how close you are to him. How do we know that you're not going to be bending over backwards to give him a carte blanche to the White House?" And Theodore Roosevelt gave this reporter a very steely look, and he said, No, you don't understand. You don't understand it at all. Lodge doesn't run me. I run him. And I think that comment says a million words about TR being frustrated that he was perhaps on a lot of occasions in the shadow of Henry Cabot Lodge, who was 7 years older, who had a significant academic career and a significant historical as an author career, and had moved up politically far quicker than Theodore Roosevelt had. And so while Roosevelt and Lodge remained very, very close during the presidency, they socialized together frequently. They went riding in Rock Creek Park. He and Nanny had frequent dinners with TR and Edith. They talked about foreign policy a great deal. Roosevelt and Lodge discussed the Russo-Japanese War. But in terms of favors, Roosevelt was very, very, very apprehensive about doing any significant favor for Henry Cabot Lodge. In fact, he would go out of his way to interview other people for a position if Lodge had recommended somebody, even if that person was perfect, because Roosevelt did not want to be seen as yet another hack politician. And there were a couple of examples. The only thing where Lodge really had a hand in terms of the Roosevelt appointment that was very, very significant was the appointment of Oliver Wendell Holmes. Wendell, as Lodge liked to call him, was perhaps the only person, or one of the few people, who had stood with Henry Cabot Lodge after the disaster of 1884. And Lodge was going to make sure he repaid his good friend Wendell when the time was right, and he did, when Roosevelt appointed him to the Supreme Court. Now, there wasn't anything wrong with this because TR had extensive conversations with Holmes, had Lodge interview him quite a bit, and so when he appointed him, he felt perfectly fine about that. Holmes did not always go along with what Roosevelt wanted him to do, and on one particular case involving the railroad trusts, Roosevelt was so upset with Oliver Wendell Holmes that Holmes had voted in the minority that he stopped inviting him for dinner to the White House. And in fact, that anger carried on when Roosevelt decided he was just going to appoint a Democrat to the Supreme Court, which Henry Cabot Lodge had, let's just say, a major conniption over, and said you can't possibly do something like that. But one of the more interesting, I think, moments in the administration or within the presidency was when Henry Cabot Lodge, who was always doing various favors for political individuals here and there because he was the political boss of Massachusetts for many years, he had received a note asking if Roosevelt would write a proclamation for the bicentennial for the city of Brookline. And Henry Cabot Lodge thought, well, that's no problem, and he just sent TR off a note and said, well, why don't you just do this? And Roosevelt read this and wrote back literally the next day, and he said to Henry Cabot Lodge, my dear man, I get requests like this all the time. I don't like them, and I really don't need to get them, especially from you. And Henry Cabot Lodge was majorly taken aback because he responded the next day saying to his good friend Roosevelt, I was only kidding. Ladies and gentlemen, Henry Cabot Lodge really did not have much of a sense of humor. He didn't joke about anything, especially politics. A couple of other interesting characters that you'll meet along the way in my book. This is Elizabeth Sherman Cameron and her husband Donald Cameron. And Elizabeth Sherman Cameron, as you can see, was a great beauty. She was one of the great beauties of her age. She was what we might call one of the great courtesans of her age. She was the eye of every man in Washington. She married Donald Cameron, a man significantly older and significantly richer than she was. I'm going to give you guys a little game of Trivial Pursuit. One of her relatives was Senator John Sherman of Ohio. Does anybody know who the other Sherman might have been? That's right. William Tecumseh Sherman, exactly. And they wanted dear Lizzie to marry somebody wealthy and important, and indeed she did. And Donald Cameron was not the nicest man in the world. He had an alcohol problem. But Elizabeth Cameron was sort of content with the marriage, because as she wrote her mother, when her mother asked how was the marriage going, she said, oh, it's going all right, because he's very good. He only comes when I call him. So she was a fantastic woman. But the man who really had his eye on her was a gentleman by the name of John Hay. And John Hay was a significant figure in his own right. He would go on to become Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of State. He had been one of the secretaries to Abraham Lincoln. He was a great literary man. He was dynamic. He held these incredible dinners in his home on Lafayette Square that everybody wanted to be at. And while he was chasing Elizabeth Cameron around, even though John Hay was married to a very wealthy woman who he didn't find particularly entertaining, but she did have a great deal of money, and she did keep him in a life that he was accustomed to. And while he was continually courting Elizabeth Cameron, he was also very interested for a little bit of time in Nanny Lodge. And there is no proof how close this relationship got between he and Nanny, but they spent a great deal of time together, chaperoned frequently by Elizabeth Cameron and this other gentleman by the name of Henry Adams. And Henry Adams was a great character in his own right, one of the great correspondents of his day. If you read any of his letters, which there are numerous volumes all available, some online, some in your library, you really will feel as if you are sitting at a wonderfully glamorous dinner party, because Henry Cabot Lodge just dishes dirt on absolutely everyone. I was talking to a historian when I was writing the book, and I said, God, wouldn't you have loved to have been seated next to Henry Adams? And she kind of, without even laughing, said, well, I'd prefer to have been seated across from Henry Adams. So one of the things about Henry Adams that I that I liked is Henry Adams was somebody who was a very frustrated man. He had been was related to John Adams and John Quincy Adams, very much wanted to be in the same milieu, the same arena that his ancestors were, but he was a biting literary critic. He rarely said anything nice about anybody, and of course these letters would get around Washington, and everywhere Adams went, he would make some really creative but obnoxious remark. And on one occasion, he was having dinner in the White House dining room. He had been invited at the last minute. And he hadn't been in the White House in some time. The last time he had been there had been decades earlier with his late wife, Clover Adams. And when he walked in to the recently renovated Red Room, as he wrote to his dear friend and his muse, Elizabeth Cameron, he described this room, which Edith Roosevelt had worked so incredibly hard on, as hideous. So he also believed that he also had been the mentor to Henry Cabot Lodge. And when Henry Cabot Lodge went into politics, Henry Adams lost complete respect for him and actually wrote at various points during the course of his life how much he hated Henry Cabot Lodge, because he believed Henry Cabot Lodge was an opportunist and someone who was just into politics for the sake of political power. He was really quite something. And he believed that Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge would break because of the fact that Theodore Roosevelt was president and Henry Cabot Lodge wasn't. He said eventually that relationship is going to hit a rock and you don't want to be around when it does. Well, Henry Cabot Lodge was delighted that he had helped make Theodore Roosevelt president. He was delighted that Roosevelt was in the White House. And as he wrote to Theodore Roosevelt at one point, he said, "I've gone as far as I can," meaning Lodge was happy in the Senate. He didn't really want to go anywhere else. However, as I said earlier, that relationship was drifting. Roosevelt, as the presidency wore on, was becoming more and more of a progressive. In 1908, William Howard Taft comes into the White House. Roosevelt departs. He goes on a trip to Europe and a grand safari in Africa. And Henry Cabot Lodge, after a time, realizes William Howard Taft does not have the stuff to be president, and he desperately wants Roosevelt back. And he begins writing Roosevelt letters. And it's kind of as if Henry Cabot Lodge is stalking Theodore Roosevelt around Africa and around Europe, because everywhere Roosevelt stopped, there was a letter from Henry Cabot Lodge. Paris, there was a letter from Henry Cabot Lodge. London, there was a letter from Henry Cabot Lodge. Nairobi, there was a letter from Henry Cabot Lodge. Roosevelt had no interest in going back to politics. He was sick of it. He was fed up. He hated the conservative Congress that had made his life so difficult, and he had no interest in going back. But Henry Cabot Lodge was wonderful at whispering in Roosevelt's ear and telling him that the public wanted him back. And eventually, Theodore Roosevelt comes back. He campaigns for president in 1912, and needless to say, this is when the bow between the two men really break. Theodore Roosevelt was, and always had been, I would argue, a progressive. And he begins to make certain campaign promises if he wins the nomination for the presidency in 1912. He says that he believes in a direct election of senators. That means all of the people would be voting. God, I didn't realize I made it on Sunday morning. That's so great. And he said, that essentially Roosevelt believed in the direct election of senators. My God, thought Henry Cabot Lodge, that means I would have to campaign in front of the general public. What a horrible idea. Worse, Roosevelt believed in this idea of eminent domain, that essentially if the government wanted some property, from whoever it happened to be and wherever it happened to be, the government had the right to take it. The other, and this was the worst as far as Henry Cabot Lodge was concerned, that if the public didn't like a decision made by the judiciary, the public could just simply hold a referendum and recall him if he didn't like that. And Henry Cabot Lodge was furious. And he, in fact, wrote to Theodore Roosevelt, and he said, "You have hurt me by these positions more than anything you've ever done to me in your whole life. I thought we knew one another. I thought we were alike. I thought we were close. I cannot support you in this campaign for president in 1912. And Theodore Roosevelt, kind of laughed it off in a way. But he was clearly bothered by it. And to Henry Cabot Lodge's credit, he really did not support anybody during the primary. There was a rumor that he arranged for the Massachusetts primary to go the way of William Howard Taft. I don't know if Roosevelt found out about that or what he thought, but once the election begins where Woodrow Wilson is running, TR is running as the Bull Moose candidate after he believes the nomination for the GOP is stolen from him. Henry Cabot Lodge is fervently campaigning for William Howard Taft, and basically everywhere he goes is telling people, we are tired of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, on the other hand, at one point gets up in Massachusetts and said, one of your senators, and I'm not saying who, is responsible for stealing the election from me. Well, the bottom line is, as we know, Woodrow Wilson wins the presidency, and during the campaign, Theodore Roosevelt is shot as he is campaigning in the latter stages of the race. He makes that very famous phrase, "It's more than a bullet that can kill a bull moose." And Henry Cabot Lodge, who learns about this, is desperately, desperately worried. And he writes these heartfelt telegrams, Theodore Roosevelt, asking if he's okay, asking if there's anything he can do, and that really heals the rift between the two men, along with their mutual hatred of Woodrow Wilson, which both of them could not stand Woodrow Wilson. The two men do whatever they can to encourage or warn the United States that it needs to be rearmed. Preparedness needs to occur before it becomes involved in the war. Theodore Roosevelt desperately tries to become commander of a regiment to fight in France, as he had commanded a regiment in the Spanish-American War. Woodrow Wilson, knowing that the spotlight would be on TR all the time, allowing him to run for president again, perhaps in 1920, he decided to let TR off the hook and say, "No, Mr. President, I'm not giving you a regiment." Roosevelt and Lodge would instead battle Woodrow Wilson in regards to preventing the League of Nations coming to fruition. Theodore Roosevelt would eventually collapse and die in 1919. He was 60 years old. And if you look at this photograph, he looks far older than 60. And that was really because Theodore Roosevelt spent so much of his life hoping to have another chance to be a boy. Too many trips down the River of Doubt, too many polo matches, too many fox hunting matches, too many falls, too many boxing matches, and in the end, he passes away in 1919. This is a photograph, a very haunting one, of Henry Cabot Lodge leaving the Roosevelt funeral in Oyster Bay. Henry Cabot Lodge would go on, remain in the Senate. He would continue the fight over the League of Nations. Everybody around him was gone by this point. Nanny was gone. Henry Adams was gone. Bay was gone. There was nothing for him except the battle, the political battle. His drive to keep the United States as a great nation and make sure that it attained the greatness internationally that he and Roosevelt had fought for so long and so hard. The thing that's really interesting is, and I came to admire both of these men a great deal, because both of these men believed, as I said earlier, in something greater than themselves. And if you think about this, and these are two paintings by John Singer Sargent, they're both in the National Portrait Gallery, fairly close to one another, which I think is wonderful. It does go to show you that if you and a friend want to do something dramatic and consequential, and you have the courage and the patience and the determination and the perseverance to do it, you can indeed change the world. Thanks so very much, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate it.